So hi all, thank you all for being here. I really didn't, we want to introduce you to the, oh, Aditi, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No worries, you're totally good. Yeah, before we begin, we have a few quick announcements. For those who would like to receive college credit for taking this course, the coordinators will be holding office hours on Wednesday before class to help you get your paperwork filled out. Please come in at 5 on Wednesday if you need help, or if you aren't sure if your paperwork is done. Maggie Harrison, who's the instructor for IDST 300, will be there to assist and confirm that you're receiving credit. So today we're going to be discussing racial capitalism and neoliberalism with Humphrey Obuobi of the San Francisco Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color caucus. Some of our coordinators had planned a presentation for today on how this topic relates to CCSF. However, that has been postponed to a later session due to time constraints. Sean and I are the facilitators for today's session, and we'll now introduce ourselves. So my name's Aditi. I use she and they pronouns, and I am a South Asian femme currently in my kitchen with a gray t-shirt on with my hair pulled back, and I'll pass it to Sean to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Sean. I go by they, them. I was born in the Miwok territory of now called Sacramento, and I was raised in the Atlanta territory, or Yelamu, right? And it is now called so-called San Francisco. I go by they, them pronouns. A brief description of myself for those impaired. I am a dark-skinned Black person. I'm wearing a striped shirt that is blue and white. I'm wearing a leopard bucket hat with a turquoise background. And first of all, we want to acknowledge that the so-called San Francisco, and I got this from Charlie, that's why I call it so-called San Francisco. Shout out to Charlie. But we want to acknowledge that so-called San Francisco is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush and Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the so-called San Francisco Peninsula. We encourage non-Indigenous members to uplift the work of rematriation and land taxes. Right now, ERA has sent a link for everybody to sit there and donate, so I count on you to donate, whether it's $1 or whether donate however much you can, but acknowledge that we are on Ohlone territory, and we are on stolen native land. We also want to be intentional with how we are creating Black, Indigenous, and PO-centered spaces. We want to move forward by creating practices to prioritize Black, Indigenous, people of color members, and proactively decenter whiteness and dismantle white supremacy at all costs, anti-Blackness, misogynoir, and colorism at all costs. Because of that, we will open our facilitated discussion to be open only to Black, Indigenous people of color first, centering queer people and disabled Black, Indigenous people of color, with the last 5 minutes being open to all such as non-Black, Indigenous people of color, AKA white folks. We are mindful of creating Black, Indigenous people of color centered spaces in the breakout rooms. Please DM Gracie, the fellow white coordinator. If you are a white person, so that we can mindfully arrange the breakout rooms. And I reiterate that because as a Black person, I don't want to be in a room where I'm the only Black person in the room, or and it's me and a group of white people. I'm not going to sit there and re-traumatize myself so that you can be better educated. That's not happening. And you should be more mindful of that. The chat is open to everyone. However, we ask white people to please be mindful over taking up too much space. The Zoom sessions will continue to be open for anyone to join, and they're really recorded. So please be mindful of what you say, because you never know who's going to watch this. You could say some things, I say some things that are just, they end up being edited out. So just be mindful of of just how, like, what you say. And then we need folks to contribute to our mutual aid fundraiser. So far, we have raised $675, which is really, really dope. And we're trying to pay, well, we're going to pay every speaker $50, right? At least. I forget what that comes out to be because I forget how many speakers we have. But at the end of the day, like, do the math. Thanks to everyone who has donated already. At the end of the day, just put your money where your mouth is. Like, nobody wants performative bullshit when you have money in your pocket. Donate if you can. I'm not telling people that, like, you don't want to tell people that are marginalized and don't have much income in the first place to donate, or people that are not in the position to do so. But if you are in the position to do so, you need to do it straight up. And now I will pass this to Aditi to do the collective care section.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, so our care coordinators, Tiara and Kari, will be providing collective care during the session with BIPOC prioritized. Please DM them if you're feeling triggered or re-traumatized by the content being discussed. If you need to be provided with care resources, or if you need to go into a breakout room with someone to take a break from the session. Our Zoom moderators will also share the anonymous care form in the chat where you can provide feedback on the session. And this is because collective care is central to abolition, which is why we're providing these resources. And that's really been shown in a lot of the previous sessions of this course as well. Now I'll pass it back to Sean to introduce Afrosoc.
Thank you so much, Aditi. So we will now hear a presentation from Humphrey Obuobi of SF Afrosoc, Democratic Socialists of America's Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color. They advocate for and build power with DSA's Black people of color membership and their communities. We pursue this work to help build collective power for working class people of color within so-called San Francisco. Started in early 2020, our caucus has supported the Defund SFPD effort established by a BIPOC-led organizing group and passed a Black liberation resolution to establish racial equity as a priority within DSA SF. Through public and internal education and agitation, we aim to continue the legacy of the Black radical tradition, as well as the radical traditions of other oppressed minorities. So boom, take it away, Humphrey.
Incredible. Okay, thank you very much. Give me 1 second. I will get this presented in just a second. All right. Where is my Zoom window? I always hate it when this happens. There we go.
No, it's so hard sometimes.
It really is. No, okay, there we go. Can everyone see my screen? I got a confirmation? Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everyone. My name is Humphrey Obuobi. I use the pronouns he, him, and I'm currently residing in the Mission District in so-called San Francisco. I am a 6 foot tall Black male, currently wearing a black long sleeve with the words, "Have you stopped growing?" on them, as a reminder to all of us. But so, as Sean had introduced, let's see, there we go. The Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus exists to organize efforts that build collective power for the BIPOC community within San Francisco and also within the Democratic Socialists of America, San Francisco. And our particular caucus is a local chapter of the National Afrosocialist Caucus. And we, as our mission statement kind of states, we very much try to focus on our local community. What can we do to kind of build collective power, reprioritize collective care, and provide for the needs within the community? We're, as Sean had mentioned, we're still a pretty young organization and are still getting our feet under us in some ways, but over the course of the past year or so, we've taken on a number of different efforts along this mission, some of which includes supporting the Defund SFPD effort, building a system within our Democratic Socialists of America chapter in order to really reprioritize supporting the Black community and Black liberation within Democratic Socialists of America, and also building a lot of other organizational infrastructure for the caucus to succeed in our mission. But where I wanted to start today was really the thing that I think all of us probably understand pretty clearly, which is our current crisis. I think as we all are pretty thoroughly aware, the many people in our society don't have the basic resources that they need to survive in the society and economy. And that includes everything from the very basics of income disparities, health disparities, where our existing healthcare system is extremely difficult to navigate and makes it such that those who lack the resources are generally can be put into debt for generations upon generations. And then also the general opportunities and freedoms that are available to marginalized communities. This is we can go into an extremely long history of how this has all come about, and we'll get into some of that. But I think this is important for us to all sort of understand and acknowledge. I think as is also directly relevant to this particular group being one that is focused on abolition, I think it's also important to call out the extremely startling statistic that 25% of the global incarcerated population is in the United States. That is a statistic that has only observed to increase over the past 40 years or so, starting with the war on drugs and a number of racist policies that were implemented in the Nixon Reagan eras, and continues to disrupt the lives of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated families, communities, etc., and continues to reproduce those same kind of disparities that we talked about earlier. And so when we start talking about these enormous problems that face our society, I think it can be very easy to fall down on two distinct things that we oftentimes come to. That is racism, capitalism, as like two isms that we often lean on. And I think like what we attempt to do, I suppose, and trying to understand how we can get ourselves out of this situation is acknowledge this, that the society as currently structured does not support the health, happiness, and freedom, but then also to dig into exactly what those isms might entail and try to understand what is racism, what is capitalism, and how those things intersect. So when we start coming to this question of like, what is racial capitalism in particular, I think there is a tendency to say, well, is it just racism and capitalism? And both of those things are phenomena that we're all pretty acutely aware of at this point. Racism being that prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism directed towards people of color, and then entirely on the basis of their race, and capitalism being a system that tends to prioritize the private ownership of capital, maneuvered for profit maximization, and oftentimes therefore, give me 1 second. There we go, that was just a siren, okay. But an economic system that prioritizes that private ownership of capital maneuvered for profit maximization, and therefore oftentimes deprioritizing the basic social environmental needs. And so what we don't want to do isn't to just consider these to be two completely distinct and disjointed phenomena that we then use to analyze our current situation, but to rather consider how those things intersect. And so when we start talking about racial capitalism in particular, what we're really talking about is the simultaneous historical emergence of racism and capitalism in the modern world and their mutual dependence. And so I think I think it's important for us to break this down one by one. And so first off, just speaking to the fact of historical interdependence. And so I think in this particular case, what we're oftentimes referring to is the long history by which, in the initial emergence of capitalism, the people of color were oftentimes sort of as those who are laboring and attached to the land. And so this is something that actually initially emerged even in pre-capitalist era, like feudalism, whereby we had people like lords who had still owned large swaths of land and had people working on the land. Those people, due to the history of how the systems came about, were oftentimes those who were darker skinned and who, based on the basis of the observable characteristics, were considered to be some underclass or like undercaste as well. And so those same sort of relations with regards to capital and the land continue to reproduce themselves over and over and over again, and continuing on as we start to see in our particular situation in the United States. And so here, and give me 1 second, let me plug in my computer before this thing dies. There we go. All right. So in this particular case, this is where we get to the current situation again, of the image on the screen being that of a confrontation even in 1907, where even in the early days of the United States and the cradle of the nation in some sense, slavery was very much a part of what enabled the United States to even gain the economic prosperity that it built up and continued to grow and espouse like over to today. This obviously in some ways caused wars and was even the basis upon which the Confederacy laid claim to its own sort of like economic and independence, oftentimes exporting the capital and the resources that were produced by slavery and by Black people on plantations into the global trade. And so this continued on and on and on, and I believe, and the same kind of relations continued into, for example, the attempt to continue to subjugate Black people through the Jim Crow laws and like the post-Reconstruction era, and then further and further into what we now observe even with mass incarceration. And so again, these kinds of we can see how these kinds of relations continue to sort of snowball into our current situation, really like are the same kinds of relations as economic and social relations as we observed even in the early days of capitalism. I think going back to the initial point here, whereby we said that not only does this particular system continue, or actually, sorry, I think I have another slide previously. Yeah, not only the like simultaneous emergence, but also that mutual interdependence. And so I think in this particular case, this is one of those situations or those cases where we continue to see that those who are in that sort of underclass are extremely dependent, or are those who actually are providing much of the labor and almost act as like the shock absorbers of this particular system. So one example that we can bring up in this particular case, which unfortunately don't have a slide for, but is in the cases whereby capitalism has or exhibits some degrees of instability. So for example, in cases like the Great Depression or the 2008 financial crisis or other such other such instances in history whereby there were enormous financial crashes, those who suffered the most were almost always in communities of color. And so whether we're talking about the majority of homes that were foreclosed, whether we're talking about the lack of jobs that then is left in the wake of these kinds of financial crises, that is almost always borne by the communities of color throughout urban areas in particular. So that particular observation does kind of lead us to believe that if those kinds of if those kinds of observations were, or those kinds of impacts were observed evenly throughout society. For example, if like racial white communities also start to face the same kinds of things, we would not accept our current situation. This is the kind of thing where we very much rely on those kinds of communities to be those shock absorbers and to take the brunt of the inequities that capitalism tends to produce. And so again, going in, it is both that mutual emergence, that mutual emergence and also the mutual independence that makes racial capitalism what it is. And so even as we are continuing to fight this kind of system in the Democratic Socialists in America SF chapter, and as we established a resolution for Black liberation, one of the main things that we particularly tried to name was the fact that racial capitalism is, or to be named not necessarily to distinguish it from capitalism at large, was to underscore that white supremacy is fundamental and inextricable to capitalism, that the enslavement of Black people did not only provide the labor that produced the accumulation of capital at the wealth of capitalism foundation, as we pointed out, but that the articulation and dehumanization of Blackness through enslavement stripped Black people of their personhood and turned them into capital. But again, not necessarily just that, just the work and the labor itself, but rather actually turning Black people and other people of color into commodities themselves that are part of this whole system of trade. This system continues to be protracted through a campaign of violence that has been resulted in the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples as well. And as anti-Blackness is outlined in the racial dimensions of property ownership, settlers' possession asserted its racial dimensions of expropriation. Capitalism itself is not only a system of extraction, but one that organizes the social structure of extraction and the systems of violence meant to enforce those particular structures through white supremacy. So again, as we were talking about, even like police and police abolition, those same systems, that's what we are referring to when we speak of those same systems of violence. And so that as a whole is a good summary of racial capitalism in and of itself. But I think what is particularly interesting to dig into is not just the fact that this system or that this particular, or that our system as it can currently be described can be described using this term that highlights these kinds of relationships, but that this is very much like the dominant system. And so the next thing that we wanted to dig into here was the question of what is this idea of neoliberalism. And so I think in this particular case, what we can kind of, a working definition that we can at least use, and one that you'll probably see if you were to just Google right now, what is neoliberalism? The definition you'll most likely get is one that basically describes it as the term used to describe the 20th century resurgence of 19th century ideas associated with free market capitalism. This is obviously a very neutral definition, and I think it's important to understand that at its baseline, that neoliberalism, that in other words, like new liberalism or resurgence in some way, relied a lot on these sort of like old foundational ideas of capitalism and reestablished them in the period after the Great Depression. And so, well, not necessarily directly after the Great Depression, but rather after World War II and like the period of more like socialized control over the economy, things like that. We saw a lot of, or the establishments of like New Deal and a lot of other sorts of more government controlled and not necessarily fully government controlled, but at least like within some degree of, or there was some degree of control there. I think the neoliberalism in particular was a whiplash against that, saying that like, no, let's go against like this idea of like Keynesian capitalism, or the Keynesian consensus as it was called, and let's now sort of reestablish this free reign free reign of private ownership, fully market capital, and unfettered by the state. And so I think in describing what neoliberalism is, we do see that particular description that yes, it's just the dominance of the free market. But I think in describing exactly what it means for us in our particular situation right now, what that means is that this is now this is a consensus that it seems like the larger global financial system has adopted, and therefore is effective, not necessarily universal, but to some degree, yes. It is what it kind of like controls like or is the kind of the foundation of like our geopolitical situation, which then seeps into the various levels of society down to like the very level of like us as citizens, consumers, and participants within our societies and economies. What we can start to break this down, like when we start to observe the scale that it's at right now, is a number of different things. And so to talk through each of these and the particular effects that it has, I think it starts to help us elucidate the extent to which capitalism, and particularly neoliberalism, that is this like broader global consensus of like free market capitalism, private ownership, etc., has led us down a particular path. And so to talk through these quite briefly, one is just this idea of hyper-individualism. And so neoliberal ideologies, the same ideologies that kind of made a resurgence in the like post-Keynesian era, places a significant emphasis on individualism, which becomes a problem in a number of ways. One is the de-emphasis of the commons and of collective ownership of like communities and collectives as concepts in general. I think the idea of the economic man, which itself we can get into a larger conversation about, but the idea of the economic man as the fundamental unit of a functioning economy itself ignores the idea that people operate in these interconnected, inseparable communities that evolve over time and evolve with each other, are interdependent, etc. That have there's an emphasis of, or there's a certain aspect of like communalism that is common to all of us in our natural state as social beings. Neoliberal ideologies tend to ignore that and instead focus on the individual transactions, interactions, etc. Hand in hand with that, I think we can also point out the idea of commodification, that most things, rather than becoming fundamental rights, human rights, needs, etc., rather become commodified and under the control of private interest. And so this is where we, as we start talking back to the same things that we mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, we start talking about healthcare. Healthcare itself is an industry that has been entirely commodified and turned into, and has a number of different implications for people's access to healthcare, and access to healthcare that actually pays attention to their like collective and individual needs, cultural needs, et cetera, et cetera. Similar to that, we're even just talking about that same example of healthcare, starting to quantify things in ways that truly make no sense. So as we start to think about like tying everything to like a particular metric or index, that tends to exclude the particular need or the peculiarities or the like the actual realities of a given situation. So for example, the fact that the gross domestic product, GDP, typically ignores a lot of genuinely necessary aspects of the way that people and societies function. For example, maternal care is an aspect that is completely excluded from any kind of measure, as well as any other aspects of just general social health that can easily be quantified. Those things that can't be quantified are oftentimes then ignored, and society, yes, aspects of like even just racial equity, and then become like a thing that is not prioritized in the economic functions. So as we start going down this project or this list, growth and globalism is another thing. I think as we alluded to before, this is a particularly global consensus that is that everyone or most dominant nations are under this particular assumption of neoliberal free market trade. And therefore, I think a lot of what we start to see is like transnational capitalism. So as the people in community or the people in communities are continuing to produce value, that value continues to spiral upward and upward into the pockets of people who have no real tie to the land or tie to the community, but rather just kind of like flows through those more like transnational capitalistic channels. And then last but not least, I think we can talk about this like over-reliance on representation. This is perhaps a little bit more of a dicey one, but you can make the argument that like neoliberalism and not the aspect of like liberal democracy and that particular concept sort of go hand in hand in some ways, where we start to rely a little bit too much on just layers of representation rather than keeping things more focused on or giving power more directly to people and communities. And so all of these things sort of like tie together to as observations of not just observations of our neoliberalism, but also just partial explanations to our current crisis. And so as we start talking about all of these aspects, we can start to tie it back to the same crises of health inequities, income inequities, even the more direct instances of racism and violence and all of these other things that we observe now can kind of be tied back to these same observations. So that was a lot on racial capitalism and neoliberalism, and mostly sort of to just explain what our current situation is. I think the question that we can start to ask ourselves is, where do we go from here? And so I personally don't like staying in the doom and gloom too much. I think in talking through these things, it can be rather heavy and like rather sort of disappointing, to be perfectly honest. But I think what we can do, and the only thing we can really do, is move forward and imagine what are better futures, what are the principles of a better future that we can imagine for ourselves and for our communities. And so I think the core thing that I'll just say, which I don't want to spend too much time going into it, but the main way that we resist racial capitalism is by placing power back into our hands and the hands of our communities and starting to reprioritize care or that collective care and the needs of these marginalized communities, our needs in particular. I think there's a long history of how this is manifested in various social movements as people of color have risen up against this particular system and tried to imagine what those alternate futures might look like. Whether you're talking about like the much longer Black radical tradition, which can be traced back, all the way back to even like the Haitian Revolution, or whether you're talking about somewhat more recent, so 50 years ago, like with the Black Panthers and the creation of like additional social services, directly meeting the needs of Black communities, of people of color within our communities. And so that kind of like organization and like reprioritizing the community ties, like the pro-social interactions that are so crucial to us just existing as and feeling safe and feeling like we actually have a say in or have agency in the direction that our lives go. All these things come by reprioritizing community in that way, and then also continuing to like organize up in ways to not just keep our I think if we are talking about a global and like a global or conundrum in some way, what we really need to do is also continue to think at that global level, or think about how our efforts can bubble up in that way, just through like whether it's through more thoughtful, or well, it all really comes down to more thoughtful organization, thinking about how, for example, larger existing transnational or corporations can be unionized in certain ways, and how power can be given back to the workers in that way. And so I think all of these things kind of tie together in ways that we can imagine those kinds of better futures, which comes down to those community ties, to thoughtful organization, to building social systems to meet the basic needs of people. All of these things are extremely important, and all pieces of the puzzle of like what one might call eroding capitalism or eroding neoliberalism as it stands today. So that is just about it. I don't think I have any other thoughts. Yeah, great. I don't know how I'm doing on time.
Dude, you like it did like perfectly. I was like so
really
stressed out. Like a lot of people, they run over time. Like you, I think, were one of the only people to end right when you were supposed to. So you're fantastic.
I paced that.
I'm also, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just like, no, great. I'm so glad I paced that.
Yeah, I'm also, it was just funny because I'm also on the mission, and like I hear, that's all we hear all day is sirens. You already know this. That's all we hear. General Hospital is right there. So yeah. So thank you so much for your presentation. And I really I appreciate like how you drew the connections between neoliberalism and capitalism and racism. I wanted to go ahead and pass this to Aditi to close out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Humphrey. I think we're now going to begin our 10-minute Q&A for BIPOC class members. So BIPOC folks, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, or type something in chat to let us know that you'd like to speak, or that you'd like to have your question read aloud for you. We'll open it up for questions from everyone in the last 5 minutes. And then after the Q&A, we'll go into a 10-minute break. And from then we'll go into breakout room discussions. Please remember to send a message to the person marked host, Gracie, to let them know if you're white, so we can arrange the breakout rooms accordingly. Excuse me. We're going to start with the question that we ask all of our presenters. In your wildest dreams, how do you imagine us creating an abolitionist world, and how does this overlap with CCSF?
Interesting. Okay. And just to repeat that back, in my wildest dreams, how do we create prison abolition or police abolition, like which of all of it?
Yeah, just that it's like an abolitionist world in general. Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. Let's see. I'll say my personal thoughts. I also have a particular quote that I like bringing up here as well. I think again, for me, it really does kind of come back to communities, and like that is a sense of like we actually know our neighbors, know our communities, like try to account, not necessarily like erase all of our differences and just say that like, oh yes, we're all the same. We're not all the same. We have there's a history of cultures and like different ways that like capitalism has affected us, et cetera. But being able to actually acknowledge those sort of differences and acknowledge the similarities between us, and sort of like rebuild a lot of those social connections that this focus on hyper individualism and commodification and all of that has kind of eroded over time. And so my vision of an abolitionist future is one where we build that sort of connection, and that evolves into a resiliency as well, whereby we're able to coordinate amongst ourselves in order to actually understand like where are the needs, how can we provide for each other in the right ways, such that we don't have to rely on any of these like larger structures that have been placed upon us and have been responsible for a lot of the violence and disruption of our that same social fabric. And so I think that's broadly how I would describe that. But then the the quote that I'll just bring in, which I forgot to put in for my presentation, but I'll just bring it up now, is from Mariam Kaba, and the book, like, We Do This Till We Free Us. Prison industrial complex abolition is a political vision, structural analysis of oppression, and a practical organizing strategy. While people might think of abolition as a primarily negative project, like let's tear everything down tomorrow and hope for the best, the prison industrial complex abolition is a vision of a restructured society in a world where we have everything we need: food, shelter, education, health, art, beauty, clean water, and more of the things that are foundational to our personal and community safety. And so I think that very much encompasses a lot of what I would sort of hope for in that sense.
Boom. Thank you for that answer. That was a great answer. And a great question. So I want to pass this to Siobhan. Siobhan had a question, so go ahead and shoot.
Hi, Humphrey. Thanks for being here and everything you shared. I have a question for you. What would you tell people, BIPOC, that think that we can remove the racism from capitalism? Kind of touching on what Kari said earlier about how, you know, a lot of people think that it's a mark of success that we see Black people becoming billionaires. How would you talk to people who believe that that is, you know, aspirational?
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects of that that I will probably want to address. One is the idea of sort of like taking, like, quote, successful Black people and sort of like put them on a pedestal as a symbol of, like, yes, this person exists, like we can do it too, like da 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 da. I think that likely is just the same kind of fallacy of like hyper individualism. Like, this is not like the idea that we should look at like Beyonce or Serena Williams or anyone else who are amazing. Don't get me wrong, but they're to say that just that like single example rather than like all of the communities that supported them and that they are part of, like, that to me is like a completely fallacious argument. And again, like both prioritizes the individualist aspect and also sort of like doesn't shoot, there was another thing I was going to say there. Anyway, there's it's fallacious. But then I think with regards to just generally trying to imagine like what does capitalism look without racism, et cetera, I think like there hasn't been, my challenge I suppose would be to just imagine what that restructured like set of like social and economic relations might look like, which in some cases, then this might be controversial, so I don't know. But in some cases, you can have markets. Markets are not necessarily like ill in and of themselves, but I think being able to actually have the coordination of those markets be centered in like the communities and like in a way that doesn't have all the same tie-ins from the previous era of things, and still tries to like to stop like prioritize social good over profit maximization. I think the issue that you will oftentimes run into that is the idea that capital begets capital, and you will just continue if you maintain this idea of like profit maximization and within private ownership, that will probably continue to spiral up until you have a capitalist class once again, and then repeat the whole story. So I think that's why I consider it a challenge. It's not necessarily that yes, you can just go forth and do that and it's going to be peachy. So there's a challenge to imagine like what that might restructured set of relations might look like. But yeah, I could probably go on lots of different directions. So, but
Sean, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, really quickly. So I am an Afrocologist at State, and it's crazy that you mentioned the Black radical tradition, because we're actually like really like literally reading into that right now. It's just wild that you said that. And I believe I belong to the activist intellectual tradition. Could you briefly explain like what the Black radical tradition is, or how it relates to, well, just explain really what it is, if you could.
yeah, I can do my best, but you might actually be able to give a better description of it since you're actively reading it. So
Right.
I'll invite you to do that in a second. Me as a non-academic, but one who likes reading, primarily got my introduction to the Black radical tradition by reading a book called Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. He kind of ends up describing a lot of what I went through in this presentation, honestly, with regards to how, with regards to the both the mutual emergence of racism and capitalism, and then also very importantly, the struggle of Black peoples to actually reimagine, or to fight against the white supremacy and imagine what those systems might look like. And so, in the way that I particularly see it is the history of the history and the tradition of those individuals, or those individuals in the communities who really sort of took us on and organized themselves in opposition to the same both white supremacy as a concept, but then also the systems that it created. So that's where we start to get not just things like the Haitian Revolution actively kind of revolting against and eventually displacing the colonizers who those who colonized them, but then also the Black Panther Party actually organizing themselves, creating new systems very steadfastly. Yeah. So that's how I would explain it. But John, I'm sure you can probably give a much more precise definition, more concise one as well.
No, I think you said it. The fact that you had for the activist intellectual tradition, you have Marcus Garvey, you have Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, people that are robbing these institutions of their knowledge and using them against them, right? But like you said, as far as examples for the Black radical tradition, the Black Panther Party is a prime example. They're really all they're different spectrum. They're on the same spectrum. So it's just studying it was really hard. I'm really scared for this exam. But to me, I think you explained it really well. So thank you for that. And then I will go ahead and pass it on to Kari.
Hey, thanks, Humphrey. Okay, wait, I had one thing I wanted to say to Siobhan because I really liked your question. And I was just thinking about it, the way that I talk about it sometimes is if we, when people ask, what if we just reform the criminal legal system to be less racist, or to be even just not racist at all? And to me, I'm okay, well, then we just have a racially diverse population of people that are incarcerated, which that's, I guess, cuter than just more Black people, a disproportionate number of Black people, but not that cute still. And I feel that's what I think of when I think of the hierarchy that capitalism creates, and the fact that a class of people that's poor and that can't meet their basic needs is capitalism necessitates that. So then we just diversify that population more, and we still don't win. And so yeah, that's just how I talk about it. But what I wanted to ask is, I feel it's a big question, so sorry if it's stressful, you can literally just punt it. But I feel sometimes I just get stressed. I don't understand how to pick an economic system or a ideology that makes the most sense to me. And I feel it's because socialism seems it's a solid choice, but then I think about how the state is really violent and it's founded on violence. And then I'm thinking about how could we create an economic system that creates justice and prosperity for us that is the same state that we fight against. So I don't know, how do you wrestle with that? Do you just believe that it'll be better? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely a big question. I think I can probably answer it kind of by talking through a little bit of how I reason about these things, where I think, to me, the main thing that matters is that what is real, I suppose, is the people, the social relations that you have, right? the communities that you sort of like live within, that you like the people you interact with on a day-to-day basis, your neighbors in some sense. They're obviously in this like much more complicated world. It's not quite that simple. I have family in Ghana and in London and like in other places where like I can't necessarily just say that it's just like this that matters. And so, but that being the case, I think what I try to prioritize in like my kind of like choice of like what is the ideal economic system, and like trying to reason through that, is that people are the people within the community are given the agency over those decisions. It is much easier, as with any economic system, to just kind of like deal with at a more local level. And so like just trying to imagine like what does the, like if we were to sort of like reform the system of San Francisco, that is a much simpler question to me than like being able to reform the global system. And when we're talking about the more recent system, then like in terms of eroding away our current system, there are certain things that we can think of. There are like public banking is like one like big thing, where like when it comes to the how our like finance or like how our money is actually utilized, like can the people have a greater say in that? Can that be used towards things that like respect the community, the environment, et cetera, et cetera? Can we build out like alternatives to can we build out alternatives to like transnational corporations providing services? So like can we, like that goes from everything from just like building, like I'm a technologist, so I think about this a lot in terms of like tech. And so can we not rely on like Google or Facebook or others such like larger transnational or corporations that have really no interest in this particular community? And can we just kind of divert that back to Europe, where our, what I would call like our socio-technical like infrastructure is actually developed like by and for like this particular community? Like there are things like that that you can kind of like start thinking about on this level at least. When it comes to the global level, I have this whole existential crisis about like the fact that there are other systems that like, or there's a geopolitics is a mess basically. And like there are like lots of like things that might lead us to like optimize for things to preserve like broader freedoms than like it's very complicated, and I can't really think about it right now, but like at the very least on the local level I can imagine us like eroding it piece by piece, and then like maybe forming like that it starts to bubble up into like more like national or otherwise.
I appreciate that. And I just want to say that that's a really good answer, and that you don't have to have an answer to that. So thanks for shooting your shot.
I had another question. Just because like racial capitalism and neoliberalism and all this, it directly affects San Francisco. People like to think of San Francisco as something that's far removed from America, but in all actuality, we are like as quintessentially American as possible. For instance, you sit there and you see skyscrapers, and at those same skyscrapers, you see people at the bottom sleeping on the concrete in front of these skyscrapers. And it's like, and I was saying this to Aditi earlier, people make San Francisco out to be some utopia-ass place when it really is just the most utopic out of the dystopias that there are, right? So with that being said, the question is, how does SF politics perpetuate racial capitalism and neoliberalism in relation to the police, and how you imagine SF politics being restructured?
So just to really quickly break down, how does SF politics sort of like contribute to the perpetuation of these particular systems, and then particularly with regards to the police?
Well, basically how you see racial capitalism and neoliberalism affecting people in the city, right? Like how do you draw the connection of this presentation to the city itself?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think like one aspect that I can definitely draw out where from the earlier presentation is one aspect of neoliberalism and like in conjunction with liberal democracy, I suppose. Like there's like some intersection there that kind of like causes, like leads to, for example, like SF politics being kind of fucked up. Sorry, apologies, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. But in, and so the particular way that I might call that out is whereby the like SF politicians might be like very dependent, or maybe not dependent upon, but like rely upon like either corporations or very much like landed folk who are not really within the working class, as like those who they kind of direct most of their attention towards. Those who are within those particular classes will also tend to not be in people or like communities of color. Like they're the same kind of thing kind of like perpetuates itself over and over again, and whereby like the way that representative democracy currently works at the very least is such that they can make those kinds of decisions. The power is again divested away from the communities who might be able to know like what is up and like what the right solutions might be or anything like that. And so that's one of the main ways I can definitely see that happening. I think like another is also in the example of like you were pointing out, like specifically with regards to like the police, where I think Defund SFPD has obviously been doing a lot of like very good work to kind of try to counter both identify opportunities to actively defund the police, but then also like create like community alternatives. And I think some of that work is probably like run into roadblocks where the people within like the board of supervisors or otherwise like would make commitments and then back off commitments and like things like that, that like like if we're really all aligned that racial capitalism is alive and well within the city of San Francisco, those kind of things wouldn't really be deliberations. It would be like, yes, we should actively right now make these decisions to divest away from the police and to actively like reinvest in community alternatives. Yeah, and also yes, Aditi, hi, you've done such great work there. But yeah, I think like things like that are whereas that I like currently kind of see that. I think you can probably also look at statistics in terms of just like who, like if you're looking at like the homeless population or the like population that's the most afflicted by like certain types of violence or anything like that, that will, the data will almost always show you directly that like, yes, like this was primary, these inequities are very much prevalent in the data. So yeah, I think there are lots of ways you can kind of like parse that out.
All right, hi there. Thanks so much for the presentation. Really appreciated how easy it was to comprehend. I was trying to just like make sure I understood the connection between racial capitalism to neoliberalism. I think this is actually one of the first times I kind of really understood neoliberalism. Like I've tried many, many times, but this is helping me get a bit farther. But yeah, just you mentioned that what the creation of neoliberalism as we see it today is very much connected to post-World War II. So could you just like recap that one more time?
Yeah, just to really quickly recap, I think the relationship there is kind of like one of a whiplash. And so I think you can dig into the actual like historics of this a little bit later because I'm not a historian necessarily, but what I can kind of tell you is that in that sort of like post-World War II or World War II era, there was a little bit of there was what was kind of like called the Keynesian consensus. It was not necessarily like free, like totally laissez-faire, like free market capitalism, but rather one that was a little bit more restrained and restricted. And I think that partially came out of like the World War II era, where there was a lot more like national unity and like a reliance upon the government, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of like creating like social services and programs and things like that in that like post-World War II era. And all of a sudden, in the observation of like what was called stagflation, there were the economic people of the time kind of like were just decided to kind of like the consensus started to shift more towards this like free market, like let's just like make it unrestrict or like unfetter the like economic system and put it all in the hands of like private ownership, like reduce like regulations, things like that. And so that was kind of the shift. But yeah, I hope that that's a good explanation. I'm definitely not the best perfect person to explain it, but I see some people also put a couple things in the chat that might be good things to dig into as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Siobhan, I think you can go ahead.
Hi, I'm Siobhan, and I saw Sean's note, my visual description. I am a mixed race Filipino and Irish woman with brown hair and a ponytail today and gold jewelry. The backdrop is my mom's garage. And my question actually, so when I was excited when I saw that you were on here, right? Afrosocialists, and forgive me because I'm not super informed about DSA. And what I wanted to ask, is that what the group that you're in? It's a caucus part of DSA?
Yes.
Or was that not you?
Oh no, that is true. That is true.
Okay,
I was shaking my head because no one would really need to know what DSA is. But,
well,
yeah.
There we go. That was my question actually, because it's something I wanted to raise in, in our group regardless, maybe on the Discord, but I am not super familiar. I joined DSA a couple of years ago because I wanted to get involved, and then I felt very, I don't know, it felt, I'll admit I didn't go to that much, but I didn't end up sticking is all I have to say. So I wanted to hear your experience in the Afro-Socialist caucus, in DSA in general, because I feel like so many people are involved with it, but kind of the context that my understanding was that it was very white, that they were a lot of theory and reading, but not really sure what they were doing like on the ground. So I see that there's maybe some truth to that from your reaction, but I just want to hear your opinion because I know they have a lot of members. So I'm just curious about if you would, how you would suggest, if at all, joining in, or do the Afro-Socialists welcome other members that are not Black? Just throwing out there of how we could, support, but in a safe way for everyone,
Yeah, absolutely. And also, thank you for bringing it up. I think there's a long and complicated history there. I think to speak to 2 or 3 aspects. My personal experience, I joined DSA February of 2020, just before the pandemic. And my experience of DSA was largely constrained to initially the tech committee, and then shortly thereafter, AfroSoc. And so AfroSoc has been most of my experience. I think from taking part in general meetings and things like that, and just I think your observations are very much on point. It is a rather white organization. There is not nearly as much community, direct on the ground community engagement as I think there really should be. And yeah, it oftentimes gets overly mired in personalities and structure and generally not actual organizing. And so I have a lot of thoughts about DSA. My long and short of it is that with regards to Afro-Socialists, within DSA, and your as in all of our particular organizing efforts, don't have to rely on those additional structures. So with Afrosocial in particular, me and the other co-chair, Rakesh Guha, who wasn't able to make it today, but the two of us try alongside the rest of the folks who have been involved, tried to run it pretty much as whatever we want it to be, where all of our priorities are very much organized towards building that actually prioritizing that community engagement as we were laying down the initial foundations, not trying to overpower any existing efforts, but rather find where we fit within the broader community of organizers within the city, and just generally trying to stay true to our mission rather than get mired in all the bullshit quite frankly. And so, yeah, I think that's basically what it is. To your last question, as far as like whether or not like non-Black folks are also welcome within Afro-Soc, the answer is absolutely. We are Afro-Socialists and socialists of color. So it is like very much open to non-Black folks as well, and like people of color more broadly. In terms of white involvement, I think like our basic rule is that like if you're a white person attending, which is happens to be like within DSA, if you are a committee, you have to kind of like allow everyone to participate. We don't have any really like active white participants, but those who do attend are required to kind of just like stay silent and like stay in their place in some sense, and less like actively requested. And so, yeah, that is basically Afrosoc. If you're interested, you can feel free to email me. Yeah, I think I also.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thanks. I think what we'll do is take maybe a short 10-minute break, and we might come back and do some more questions, because I think this conversation has been really great and really fruitful. So we'll do a 10-minute break, and we'll come back, I guess, at 7:21, unless someone tells me otherwise. Cool. Thanks, Ellen. Cool. Great. I don't know if anyone else has any questions that they want to ask. We can open it up to everyone. If any non-BIPOC folks have questions for the presenter as well, feel free to raise your hand or let us know in the chat. Any other questions? If not, I don't know.
Oh, I'm here. I'm sorry.
No worries, you're good. Maybe we can move on to breakout rooms. I think we're going to do them for 10 minutes. If you feel uncomfortable in your breakout room, feel free to return to the main session. And presenters, Humphrey, you're welcome to stay in the main session or join the breakout room, whatever you feel comfortable with. And just thank you so much for your presentation and also for the discussion that we all had. It was really great to hear everyone's really great questions too. I don't know, Sean, if you want to quickly introduce the question that we had for the breakout rooms.
Thank you. I really have to find it, but I'm going to do so much chatting. It really was, how do people see neoliberalism and capitalism and racism? How do they intertwine, and how do you see those intertwinings happening in the city of San Francisco, or so-called San Francisco, or just in California in general? Because I believe that people, like I said earlier, believe California is some utopia, or San Francisco is some utopia. And I guess in relation to other places, it's more utopic, but like I said, it's still the most utopic dystopia that there is. So the real question is, how does this really affect where you are? And if that wasn't clear enough, if somebody could comment in the sections, can you clarify, or yada yada yada. I can also add the Q to the question as well, but if people need more clarification, just put it in the chat. Oh, boom. Okay, cool. Okay, so how does neoliberalism, racial capitalism affect us in our daily lives on a personal level? Yeah, in a sense, more of how. Yeah, exactly. Actually, really, thank you. Exactly. But how you see it in your daily lives, and how do you see it I think the majority of us live in so-called San Francisco. And I wanted to the real question is, how do you see it playing out in San Francisco, right? Or how do you see it playing out in your actual focused on SF, but most of not all of us live in SF. So just how do you see it affecting your lives?
Cool. So I think we'll go ahead and open the breakout rooms now.
In the breakout rooms, would any Black, Indigenous, people of color folks like to share a reflection from their breakout room? Either do so by raising the hand or putting your name in the chat so we can call on you, or just voice your reflection in the chat if you don't want to be called on. Perfect. Oh, a song they wanted to share. I was gonna say, Gracie, did you want to play it, or should we like? Oh my God, it's LaDonia. I love LaDonia. They're from the Mission. I love this song. Oh my God, sick.
Sorry, I don't have an account. Does anybody else, it won't let me play this song. Does anybody else have Spotify? So
I do.
sorry.
I can
Yay.
do it. I can't share it though, Gracie. I think you need to make me a host.
Okay, just did. Thank you.
Desde San Francisco para el mundo, ¿cuándo se van? ¿De dónde vienen y cuándo se van? Ratas que quieren comer nuestro pan, que nos ofrecen y que es que nos dan. ¿De dónde vienen y cuándo se van? San Pancho te quiero, nací aquí, cuánto te debo, y yo ni te conozco en la forma que tú estés. La gente pintada, sus caras tan blanqueadas, ha cambiado todo, su dinero y maldad. Demolieron las casas, reemplazan con vidrio y acero, cortaron las venas de mi linda ciudad. Vaya donde vayas, no eres nada sin tu gente. Quizás algún día ellos regresarán. ¿De dónde vienen y cuándo se van? Ratas que quieren comer nuestro pan. Ay, ratitas que nos ofrecen y que es que nos dan. ¿De dónde vienen y cuándo se van? Ay, dime cuándo se van. Sueño con terremotos, la ciudad para nosotros. Sueño con temblores y ellos se van. Sueño con terremotos, la ciudad para nosotros. Sueño con temblores y ellos se van. ratas que quieren comer nuestro pan, que nos ofrecen y que es que nos dan, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, ratas que quieren comer nuestro pan, que nos ofrecen y que es que nos dan, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, ay, cuándo se van, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van, de dónde vienen y cuándo se van.
First of all, we need to like shout out the fact that she is from the mission. Like the mission is in the house. Let that shit be known. Okay. She is from the mission. Okay. Like she is just so sick. I'm so glad we got to play that song. Aditi, did you have any comments or did you want to like take over from this part on?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you all so much for sharing. That was so good. I wonder if anyone else, does anyone else have any reflections that they want to share with the cohort, or any thoughts on the song, or anything that brings out from folks? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was like, I guess I just wanted to share, felt super serendipitous, Sean's question at the end, because I was just at a view the other day looking at the city at SF and was trying to like really just like reframe and just be like, okay, just completely from like what I care about and the world that I want, like what do I see and how does it make me feel? And for the most part, it was like, oh, it's kind of ugly, you know? Just skyscrapers and wasted buildings and that big I Heart SF in a hotel room that is filled with empty rooms. So there's just all these symbols of what we're talking about, of racial capitalism, of neoliberalism. So, and yet I still love the city, right? We still love it. So
Oh, you froze. Oh, damn it. I think they are having some technical difficulties. I was gonna say my only takeaway from said period was that I was having a conversation with one of the classmates that's actually from LA, and they came and joined us all the way in San Francisco. You know, which city is better? Obviously the city, JK. But the point that they made was, I was sitting there saying that I think that we live in a very neoliberal city, and that the city itself is like it's very performative. And you know, I didn't really get like all the person power that we had in these movements across the country. If you had that same person power doing the work underneath, I believe that we could have definitely gotten a lot further. However, our Angeline X sat there and was like, hey, yo, like at the end of the day, I think that people are doing these things. However, it's not being shown by the media, and it's being called by the government. Oh, go ahead. Is it Micha? I'm sorry.
Hi, y'all. Oh my gosh, that was so funny. My computer died. I was like at the peak of my sentence too, and it just, oh, fuck. I was just saying that I was already thinking about this, so the fact that it came up in conversation with community was really dope, and it was cool talking about it with everyone. That's all. Thank you. And it's Mika, by the way. Thank you for asking, Sean.
And thank you for correcting me. Thank you.
It's all good. It's all good.
You already know we're in this together. I'm gonna pass it on to Siobhan to make comments on their reflection group.
Yeah, so everyone in our group is in so-called San Francisco, and we were talking about two main things. One is kind of like these recall campaigns feel very neoliberal. The school board, kind of like the reaction in the way that all these, I don't know, just the school board recall, the DA recall attempt, it's extremely neoliberal because they're coming, and I think the most upsetting part about the school board one was with Allison Collins' tweets, all these white people telling me, we're recalling for, and not specifically me too much because I'm not as visibly Asian, but saying, we're doing this for Asian people, like we're so upset for you guys. And I was like, the fuck, like I grew up in SFUSD and I know exactly what she was talking about when she talked about these things in her tweets. But that, the fact that we have a Black mayor and police chief and a lot of people hide behind that. And also kind of we discussed the challenges talking to our families. Aditi said really great, if it's okay if I share what you said, as far as respecting, what are kind of like talking with our parents, if we have, immigrant or parents who grew up in poverty, who have like made it in a sense, talking to them about what neoliberalism kind of is and how they're perpetuating that while still respecting the validity to their experiences. And kind of the big struggle is how to talk with other, BIPOC about these things, because it's so, especially in San Francisco where I grew up, most of my friends are people of color that now, like a lot of them work in tech, and they think that it's just kind of like, there's a taste of the wealth that now it's kind of like turned into like a wealth lust, like they deserve it and they made it, and now it's all about luxury and we can live luxurious now, and that's a sign of equality. And it's just, it's a hard thing to talk about with your friends, to tell them like, y'all, like that's a taste, that's not, yeah, that's all I have to say about it. But it's a hard conversation to have with people who have, now obtained and come up in some sense. Convincing them to stand together with this cause and solidarity is not really something that's really expected or encouraged.
I think that's a good point. Like, because I as well know a lot of San Franciscans born and raised that are working in tech, and at some point you kind of want to forgive them and understand, like, hey, yo, like the city has been gentrified, and the only way you can make this amount of money is by going in this way. But it's like I have family members, it's very personal, but I have family members that, one, like my cousin-in-law is an SFPD pig, and then my other cousin, like her husband is actually like a sheriff. And it's just like, at the end of the day, I get you want to make changes, and I get that you see this force being helpful, and you being a part of this force being helpful, right, or assimilating to the culture, when in all actuality you're perpetuating oppression. And as are the same with the San Franciscans born and raised that are in the tech industry. Like, it's just like, at the end of the day, like when the pandemic hit, they all moved out, and it's like, like, stay out of the city, and it's just really sad that, like, we live in a world that capitalism, it comes back to this, but we live in a world that capitalism like guides our every move in a way. No, exactly. I'm gonna read what Siobhan just said. It's really hard watching men I know / grew up with, especially Black and Latin men, become cops, justifying it by thinking it's either helping or a great paycheck. And that's exactly what I'm talking about with my cousin and his wife. That's like legitimately what I'm talking about. They had a kid, they got married, you know, they're living the quote unquote American dream, which is really a fucking fallacy. But at the end of the day, they're sitting there and they believe that, like, he originally was an SFPD pig. And I just talked so much shit. I was like, bro, we were so cool. And then you sit there, you betray me like this. We are not cool. Like, we cannot be friends. And their justification was, I want to change the system. And it's like, how are you going to change the system when, like, you know, like, when you're in the system, you know? And they like you said, they believe it's a great paycheck and it's like a great form of changing things, and it's just really not. At one point, I ragged on him so bad that he stopped. He like dropped out of becoming a pig, and we were like, cool again. We were like, yay. And then the bastard came back and decided to become a fucking sheriff. So I'm like, dude, why? Like, you know, and it's just like, I feel like people think that, like, not to disrespect my cousin, he's not a bastard, but he's a pig. But at the end of the day, I still feel like they want to change the system, and it's like, you can't change a fucked up system, period.
I wanted to also just mention that Kari put in the chat the care form. So if folks have any feedback from today's session, please feel free to put it in that form and fill it out. Cool. Great. I don't know if anyone has any last comments. I think we're pretty much at time, but this has been such a great session. I'm so glad that I was able to come. Any last thoughts, Sean?
I really want to thank everybody for being a part of this discussion, everybody being a part of this class. I want to thank Aditi. I want to thank Humphrey. I want to thank Ira and Gracie and just every, like, you know, like we all have made it happen. And I'm just very grateful to be in a space to where, like, we can all learn from each other, you know, and we can all sit there and continue to grow and be like a more utopic, like, dystopia, if you will. Like, I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, and I'm like immensely grateful. Also, thank you very much, Aditi. You definitely added to this, and I'm very grateful for that. Right. And the fruits of us coming together turned out really, really well. Humphrey, did you want to go ahead and speak?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thank y'all. This was really fantastic. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to actually speak with all of you, to hear all of your amazing thoughts and analyses and just experiences in general. You are all welcome to hit me up anytime, whether it's about Afrosocialists or just to meet a friend. So yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you all. And then Aditi, did you have any closing comments?
No, thanks everybody, and thanks Sean, and Gracie and Ira and all the coordinators for putting this together, and everyone who shared all their thoughts. Thanks so much. Cool. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a great night, everybody. See you Wednesday.
Have a good night.